a yellow screen of death or something like that, it would return a nice error message for the person on the other hand to like handle it, gracefully. So, but when we did that, we now came across a problem. We're now like, okay, what if I had two operations? What if I called two methods and I needed to combine their results in some way? And, that kind of a thing. And, from experience using things like link and observables and task of T and task parallel library and so on and so forth, using those things, I now realized that, okay, there's this pattern that those libraries follow. I think I could use something like that. Maybe have a next function that I would just pass it a function that returns the second operation. And that way I can compose operations together, right? So as you can see, I was stumbling across the monad pattern, but I didn't know that it was the monad pattern. So what I did was I had like a shoddy implementation. And it was after I'd watched that video that it clicked that my operation is just a monad. And if it's just a monad, it can follow all the protocols of being a monad so that you could compose them and things like that. So immediately I now got into action after watching the video, made it into its own library, put it on NuGet, and now implemented all the different methods of the monad pattern. Then as I dug deeper, I now noticed that the link expressions in C#, that's the link syntax, is actually not link syntax at all. It's actually not tied to iEnumerable. It's just a facade over the monadic bind. It's a facade for calling monadic binds. So it's syntax sugar in C# to allow you to do what is essentially monadic binds and stuff like that. So it was at that moment it clicked, and I was able to, add support for that to the operation library. But when I did that, I now saw, I can't remember, I think it was a blog post from Scott Washing when he was talking about computational expressions. And I realized that in FSharp, they even take it a step further. So in other words, all sequences, asynchronous, anything async, sequence, and so on are all computational expressions, which are just syntax sugar for calling bind on objects and stuff like that. When I realized that, it now dawned on me that FSharp takes this whole concept of computational expressions, monads, and so on to another level. It was at that point it dawned on me that there is so much more to FSharp than C#, that FSharp is essentially a superset of C#. And that's when, the fire for FSharp started to really burn.
It's interesting that you kind of came into functional programming through inventing your own kind of monad. Sounds like it was something like the either monad.
Yeah.
But you came across that first, and that's what struck your spark, as opposed to being told that I've been bitten by mutable objects. I want something immutable, or the types aren't as well, and I want something that's more typed like a Haskell or an FSharp or the pattern matching or some of these other things. But you apparently got into it via discovering and implementing the monad pattern without even realizing it. So that's an interesting approach that you kind of came in from the side that's the quote difficult side of functional programming than just making and starting everything out as immutable, or just passing functions around and realizing, even if I had a delegate in C# back in the early days, that was essentially the attempt at doing a function as a first-class data object.
Yeah.
So you pick that up, you get that information, you start seeing all of this. You said you started looking into Haskell. What was the first steps of saying, I see the power here, I'm falling in love with some of these ideas because I've already kind of had it click? What happened next?
Yeah, so what happened next was I started looking into the Haskell ecosystem. And a language is beyond just the tools. It's beyond just the language itself. You have the tools, you have the ecosystem, you have the libraries, you have the skill sets, and so on and so forth. So what ended up happening was, okay, I started looking at Haskell. I got a book on it. I started reading it. I even learned how to use like Cabal and all those stuff. I actually downloaded Lexa, the Haskell IDE. I started playing around with it and stuff like that. But what happened was I have to work, right? And as I'm doing my work in my office, I'm busy doing this Haskell thing, and I don't know how to introduce it to my work or find a way of really. It's almost like the knowledge I was gaining, I couldn't really apply it, So I was like, okay, maybe what I should do is let me first learn FSharp, then from there, move on to Haskell and all that. So, but what struck me about Haskell though was I am actually a big fan of type safety. And I saw that the Haskell compiler is like that thing is a work of art, to put it lightly, because I think the language with the compiler together, they are like a very strong team, to the point where it catches a lot of things at compile time that the chances that you would have a runtime exception is really, really low compared to like C# or languages we are used to. So that was the thing that actually, got me interested in Haskell, really. But why I didn't, pursue it further was because it was a different syntax. It would mean learning a new library, having a new tool chain, and all those kind of things. And I wanted something that I could easily apply right now, like, and stuff like that. So that's basically what happened.
And how much time did you spend with Haskell as you were starting to dig in and learn these lessons before you said, I like this, there's something here, but I'm not going to be able to take advantage of everything I'm learning. I need to look at FSharp.
Yeah. So I had played around with Haskell for like 2-3 weeks. In fact, there's a video on YouTube. I don't know if I can find it later, but it was like an hour long. And that video takes you through Haskell like a blitz from zero to hero. So it starts from the very beginning. It explains the Haskell language, the syntax, how to do pattern matching and all those other stuff. But the way I learned things by doing them. So I needed a project I could do that while I'm doing this, I'm learning the language as well. But there will be no motivation to do the project if I couldn't immediately apply the things I learned from the project. So that was basically what happened. So I now decided, okay, let me look at FSharp first. Then maybe by the time I master FSharp, I can now go back to Haskell. At that point, I would have a stronger footing in functional programming to take Haskell on.
And so you jump into FSharp, you start digging in, you start learning this. What did your project look like then? If you were probably the only one in the area or at your office that was into this, but you still wanted a project, how did you find something that was applicable if you weren't finding something that was applicable in Haskell? What were you picking up on FSharp that you started working on? Was that just a side project at work that you were doing just side by side with something else, or what did that look like?
Okay, so yes, it was a side project. I was trying to build an e-commerce application. I called it Jumia. I even did it's on my GitHub. I even did the like planning and strategy and all that using ASP.NET and just F-Sharp in general. Just seeing what the F-Sharp flow looks like for building real world applications, like web APIs using single page applications like Angular and so on and so forth. So I was building a full system. I think I didn't finish, but I had gone far. But what immediately struck me was that the tools, the patterns I used when I was building like C# applications, I couldn't use them for F#. Not quite. I could use them for F#, but it didn't quite sit right. For example, in C#, using the clean architecture, you'd have to like create interfaces, use dependency injection, have services and managers and all those kind of things. And it's a lot of bloat, right? Whereas F# is a very succinct language. And in F#, instead of doing that, you can use a partial application and injecting into functions and things like that. So I needed to figure out a way of building real world rich client applications using F#, but doing it in such a way that I'm not repeating my C# habits in F#. I'm writing it as a native F# application. That whole approach was a journey unto itself for me.
And you start to feel comfortable enough.
Yeah.
And listening to your conversation with Scott, you mentioned that you were able to get it into your work and you've had other coworkers use it.
Yeah.
What was the adoption process that said, hey, I got this new language, we're going to start taking advantage of it and not be essentially shuttled out the door being crazy of saying, whoa, no, we're good here. What was the story around that to be able to say, hey, I've got something and work to sell it and actually get it adopted?
Yeah, so the process of that was very difficult to say the least, because there is this article, I think, I can't remember who wrote it. The title of the article is kind of link baity sort of, but it's related to what the article was talking about, which is why your F# evangelism is not working. And essentially the post boiled down to the fact that C# is good enough for pragmatists not to jump on it, right? So in every culture, in every group, you have the early adopters, you have the pragmatists, you have the, I can't remember the other group, and you have the laggards or so. So the pragmatists, you need enough pragmatists to jump on your platform for your platform to become mainstream. right? So the pragmatists in my office, when I showed them F#, they were like, no, we're good. We have C# already. I had to explain to them using things, showing them things like property-based tests, because I think I've seen that test is a really neat way of introducing F# into a system. I started by rewriting most of the tests using F# and making them property-based tests. I also had to show them like the succinctness of F#. So I would re-implement certain things, right? Certain DLLs that we had used like massive amounts of code to do. I would re-implement them in F#. And by the time they saw that, oh, this is far more succinct, this is something that we can plug in and use. This doesn't require us to go and start learning a new language or, changing our tool stack. That was what, helped the adoption. So a lot of times we in the F# community, we like the new and shiny, but we need to realize that for more people to come on board, we need to be able to demonstrate to them that, no, use the tools you are using now, right? All your skills are not wasted. And if you can show them that they can reuse everything they know, it will make the transition much easier. Then at that point, you can now start using whatever sophisticated tools that your functional programming provides.
So property-based testing, I've heard, is one of those hooks, as you mentioned. You've also shown the conciseness can become appealing depending on if people have your first gut reaction of, I'm not sure about the syntax, and can actually get over that. What were some of the other approaches? Did you use something else? Like you got approached to with that video of saying, here's some C# stuff that we can do, but like here's how it translates into this based off your coworkers' scars and experiences and things they were complaining about. Were there certain things that help make the FSharp sale easier in that sense as well?
Yes, yes, yes. I think I was kind of lucky, right? Because like I was telling Scott, right, we built a real-time system, a very massive computer-based test that was for the whole nation. So while we were doing that, we needed to be like getting the responses in real time. Then at the end of the day, now do like batch processing on all of them. So that experience was a harrowing experience because we now realized that essentially just all the buzzwords you hear about functional programming, that immutability is important, or this is important, or that's important. We were actually burnt by them before we as a team now realized that, okay, immutability is important. We need to figure out how to do immutability properly. We need to start looking into actor models and frameworks and things like that too. When I was bringing F# to them, I was coming at them from the perspective of, we have stretched C# to the limit of what we can do. Here are some things we can do in F#, like using Akka.net in F# to serialize actors and transfer them, or using, in fact, this was a big one, using F# to write DSLs. Because for example, there was a project we were doing for a school, for a group of schools, where each school had certain rules for promoting students. And those rules varied wildly. So, you had no way of knowing what rule a school would prefer. And the school may want to change their rules dynamically. So we try to figure out how to hard code those rules as text and store them somewhere, maybe a database file system or something like that, so that the school could change them, right? So initially we tried to use expression trees in C# to accomplish that, but it was a messy hack, you know. But by the time I saw I think it was Phil Treford's talk on using F# to write DSLs and how incredibly easy it was, I was able to like tell them that, look, these parts of the application, we should write it in F# because it's, we can easily declare our DSL for defining the rules for promotion, and then use F# code. We have to compile those rules and now use those rules to now perform promotions and things like that. So it's those niche areas that I was able to like show them that, look, the existing tools can do the work, but it is a lot of work as opposed to using something like F# and getting it out the door quickly.
And you mentioned Akka in there, and specifically Akka.net. Was that something that you picked up as well with the F# time, or was that some exposure to Akka before your F# work? And how did each one of those kind of flow back in between the Akka.net and your F# experience and kind of feedback each other's learning in? Because I know there's some similarities in thinking.
That is different. I never thought that I could just literally have like a hard-coded text, and that's actually my return value. That's cool. That is cool.
There's some differences with the reactive programming aspect, the message passing, the stateful management, and kind of keeping that isolated and being stateful while being immutable to some extent. How did those things feed back into each other, and what was the timeline of Akka compared to the FSharp?
Okay, so I mentioned the original project where we were doing a real-time system that was for performing computer-based tests for the entire nation. And while we were doing that, like I told you, we came across the fact that, immutability is important. The moment if you are dealing with highly concurrent systems, the moment you put a lock anywhere in that system, that lock is the slowest point of that system automatically. So we needed to find a way of doing all the computation without having to use locks. So at that point, we started looking for different solutions, and that was when we came across Akka.net. And when we came across Akka.net, reading the history, found out that, okay, it's a port of Akka from the JVM, which was written in Scala, a functional language. So at that point, that was when the reputation of functional languages started to rise in my company, really. That was even before I had, started taking FSharp seriously and all that.
And so Akka was a little bit before you took FSharp. Once you started playing with FSharp, taking it seriously and feeding it back in, how did the Akka.net learnings feed into your FSharp? And then once you learned FSharp, how did you feed that back into the Akka.net learnings?
So the Akka.net didn't really feed into the FSharp because most of the Akka.net implementations we had were just C# based. But, I'm a huge fan of Akka.net because that was what actually, it did what is essentially a miracle, because then processing, when the initial implementation we had for that was like 2 years ago, it was taking 6 hours plus to process those gigs of information. And what we now, and of course, the clients needed the results to be sent that day. Because of that, our client was not happy, stuff like that. But the moment we now realized that, okay, rather than using a database to store our states, let us instead keep our states in the Akka system and save them to raw files. And after we save them to raw files, we have a service, we have an Akka actor that will just sweep that information using bulk inserts into the database. So it wasn't until we did that our processing time dropped from that 6 hours to about 25 minutes. You won't imagine. So it was a huge boost for us, right? So at that point, selling Akka was like what's the word now? He was a hero, essentially. So, but by the time I was able to tell them that, oh, look, the original Akka was written in Scala, that now, helped, change the perception of functional programming in my office.
And if you pick up Akka first and you learn FSharp, and I've heard that the Akka.net side plays really nicely with FSharp, what were some of those things that changed if you were able to take advantage of the benefits of FSharp tied with the Akka, and how you approached using the Akka.net and the rest of the code because you were now using FSharp with it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the FSharp, I don't know how the Akka team did it, but somehow the FSharp API is way more powerful than the C# API for Akka.net. So with Akka.net in the C# API, you essentially create what is a class that inherits from a receive actor, and you just specify the messages you want to receive, and that's it. You have no control over how the messages are sent and all those kind of things. But the FSharp API takes it a step further. So with the FSharp API, they have what's an actor expression, and they have the ability for you to serialize and transfer actors. So, for example, you could have your web farm, your farm of actor systems could be using a version of your DLL, and then you could serialize actors and send them over the wire, and they would reify them in memory using FSharp. FSharp has quotations. There's a feature of FSharp called the FSharp quotations that allows you quote blocks of code. So essentially, you can put your actor in quotes, serialize it, send it over the wire using FSharp. They've already built all of that into Akka.net, and those actors would become available on the remote system without having to change DLLs, without having to essentially upgrade the application. So that's one of the powerful features about it. The second powerful feature about it is that it gives you access to the inbox. So with the C# API, you don't have access to the inbox, but with the FSharp one, you do have access to the inbox. And it's even much nicer. So you could just take a function and just wrap it in an actor straight away, as opposed to the C#, which requires a full-blown class. So the FSharp API is so much nicer compared to the C# API. And once I was able to sell Akka to most of my coworkers, selling them that, oh, look, what you're doing in Akka is nice, but look at what the FSharp equivalent looks like. It allows you to declare states as a mutually recursive function. So you could have functions that reference themselves, and those functions would be the different states of the actor, which is very neat and very straightforward. So
Two-phone message.
That's pretty much it.
And I believe in your conversation, you mentioned you had a coworker with some Erlang experience and with the functional programming experience. If you had that coworker and he was talking about his Erlang experience and functional programming experience, how much of that helped feed in as you were learning this stuff, and even taking advantage of the Akka.net stuff if it's very similar? And because I believe you've also mentioned something about maintaining state and not needing to actually persist to a database. And if you're kind of doing that with the Akka, that sounds something that's very Erlang-ish, is you don't need a database if you can just hold everything in your actors. How much of that stuff that you got from this coworker helped feed into your learnings of FSharp or even Akka.net?
Okay, so actually the first coworker I worked with who was looking at Erlang, that was actually at my previous place of work. So he was the one that first mentioned functional programming. Up until that point, I had never heard of functional programming before. So he was the one who said, there's this thing, Erlang is a functional program, and that he's looking into it. And I was like, why? What are you doing it for? And, he explained that it is a completely different way of thinking. And, that was what's got my fascination. Like, okay, this functional programming is sounding interesting. But
time out. I could easily see these two parameters being swapped accidentally. I can easily see that. I'm not sure. Not sure what the best technique is. First, we know that the last two parameters is going to be the to/phone and the message, right? This says from phone and message. And so we want to swap this with from phone. This is to phone, right? So send it SMS key and then to phone. So this is right. But part of me is like, it's still easy to screw up. So I'm curious if I should just introduce some types and say like type from phone equals string, like that. It's been so long since I messed around with discriminated unions. Let me do this. and then type toPhone equals toPhone of string, something like that. So if I do that, that might be fine. So then we can say let from phone, I don't know, that right there equals from phone, and then we just put in from phone. That, and of course I'll refactor this, and I'll lift this this type into this parameter up here later. And we'll do the same thing with toPhone, right? The toPhone is actually, yeah, I think I can still do it. Yeah, can I? Whatever. toPhone equals right there. Somehow this would be the v.courier, whatever. Which means that we have toPhone that. Which means that we can have, probably replace it like this if we wanted to. Okay. Which then means that this would be from phone, and then you would have your from phone, and then I just screwed up again. Hold up. This is toPhone, right? Okay, oh, yeah. So we have toPhone. This would be toPhone. And then the other one, get rid of that. And then the other one would be from phone over here. And then this would be from phone. And the purpose of doing this is so that you can't accidentally swap arguments and it executes because it doesn't care. Now we have the compiler enforcing this and making you be explicit what's the toPhone and what's the from phone. Okay. So that's fine. And yeah. This right, yeah, I think we're good for right now. Oh, so then we could just do this right here. Say from phone. It's gonna be up here. So we can now get rid of this. Right. Or we could say, well, like that. Okay. And so then we should get a compiler error for whoever is the client to this offline courier as a sync. I was expecting an error to come somewhere. Hold up. Why didn't I get an error? Because more than likely it's commented out. Hold up. That's probably the reason why. Yeah, it's commented out. But we would say var from phone. Yeah. Var from phone equals, and then you just say new. Is it new or is it just from phone? Dot new from phone, like that. And then you would put in the Twilio file. Something like that. And we would throw that in here. And that would build, right? We have solicit commented out, but it would be something like that. Back to our regularly scheduled program.
Then I mistook it for like procedural programming. So I thought that, functional programming is just procedural programming with a bow tie or something like that. So, but it wasn't until Yang Kui's interview in .NET Rocks that I realized that, functional programming is way more than just, Pascal or something like that.
Okay, and I wasn't sure how much of when that overlap was, if some of those lessons could be borrowed by pinging that coworker and say, well, you're doing this. I know you've talked about the Akka model. Are there any tips? And I didn't know how much of a support system you had for picking.
And now I'm going to, since I like this so much, I'm going to expose it as its own module so that it can be reused.
Picking up and learning some of this stuff, whether it's the Akka side or the FSharp side.
So my experience with functional programming and FSharp in general is that I was just stumbling onto things, right? Like until you mentioned it just now, that the idea of storing all the state in a memory in your actors and later like either serializing it to file and not needing the database, that has never occurred to me. In fact, we just stumbled upon it. It was because at the time we had a machine. It was just a single server, but that was a very beefy server. It had like 120 cores or so. Yeah, I think 120 cores with terabytes of hard disk space. But even that server couldn't handle we were using SQL Server at the time. It couldn't handle the workload of the amount of queries we were pushing to it. So it was always failing, to the point where even we tried stored procedures to try and see if we could accelerate the speed at which it's entering into the database, but it was still not good enough. So it wasn't until we now decided that, okay, having a single source database where we could just push all the data to is just too much. Let us try storing it to files first, then sweeping those files into the DB. In essence, what I'm trying to say is that we were forced to not consider the database our single source of truth. Rather, we should consider the program itself, the application, to be the source of truth. So it's one of those things that we stumbled upon, not because we had maybe seen it in Erlang or something.
And it sounds like you've been very fortunate in stumbling a lot of these patterns first and then realizing that, there's something else here, and being able to make some of those connections. And one of the reasons I kind of wondering about that is you also mentioned you've got this interest in immutable databases. Some of that probably comes from the .NET background, because I know event sourcing was big. If you're talking about functional programming and immutability in general, that's big. What actually kind of triggered that interest in the ideas around immutable databases and made it something that sounds interesting and appealing to you?
Yeah, thank you. The same application still. What happened was we tried, I told you the database was too slow to handle the kind of workloads we were dealing with. And we ended up using flat files, right? To just store the data first, then have a separate service, just push that data to the database. Because one of the things we realized was that sorting duplicates was one of the most difficult things you could ever do. So we were now forced to just accept everything. And then at the point where we are querying, now filter out the duplicates. But at the point where you're just accepting everything, at that point, why do you really need a database at that point? So that was one of the small tenets we got out of it. The second was that, like I told you, we had a system that was real time and all that. But Nigeria is not like Western countries and stuff where you have good connection everywhere across the country. We had very bad connections in certain states.
Love it.
So what we did was we had the servers in those states would cache the data. They would store the data locally, and then they would return the servers back to headquarters. And we had a feature where it gave the users the ability to reset the application, essentially. They asked for that feature to reset the application and wipe the database clean and things like that. So because we knew it was a dangerous feature, we decided, okay, we're going to put guards and blocks. It was a setting you had to go and enable. After enabling the setting, you would click wipe exam or something like that. And even after you did that, it would still ask you, are you sure this is the consequence of, and so on and so forth. And out of the 400 centers we sent out these machines to, there was one where the person went through all those hoops and still reset the database, still emptied all the data. All the data was lost. So when he brought the laptop back, we looked at it and we were confused because we're like, why would you do that? So we had to get some SQL Server tools to get the data back from the log. And even that wasn't good enough. So ultimately, the candidates had to rewrite that exam. And that was very painful. And the PR nightmare alone from that incident was just crazy. So it was at that point, we started to ask ourselves as a team, data is key, right? So how come we have tools like source control where we never lose code, whereas we are free to lose data? So it was at that point we started, looking at, okay, can we have a database that is immutable, similar to Git, such that anytime you added data, it just adds to the database. If you try to remove, it just adds a statement of removal, or it retracts data, it retracts facts from the DB. So that was where my interest in immutable database started. And I took a look at a few of them. There are just two of them right now. The first one is Event Source, and the second one is Sonic, I think from the guy who did Clojure. And it's a pretty good idea. And I feel like it's going to be the future of storing data because storage nowadays is very cheap. And more importantly, I feel like it is more natural to the functional paradigm. So for example, in functional programming, we know that things are immutable by default. In other words, once you create data, once you create an object or when you create a piece of data, you can't change it. You can either replace it or create another one on top. But that's why they call it a persistent data source or something like that, which means that it is always available. You always have every history of this object is always in memory or something like that. So the functional paradigm is not mutation friendly. It doesn't like a mutation. Functional programming in general doesn't really like mutation. So as a result, it's kind of funny that our databases are essentially mutation heavy. So you have a record in your database and somebody goes and changes the value of that record. It's still the same record, but what you've done now is that history, the previous records are now lost essentially. But if you had an immutable database, all of a sudden you would be able to use your database as a value, which is really appealing. And I think it will make a lot of sense for people who are writing functional programs.
And you mentioned Event Store, and I know that kind of came out of the C# arena with some of the command query responsibility segregation and event sourcing stuff. Was that something that you had been exposed to in your time doing C# or Java that kind of translated into some of these ideas? Because when I was working in that ecosystem, there was that idea, and it just was one of those things looking at the actor model that kind of aligned pretty well, because if everything is just messages as object-oriented was stated to be, and you've got the actor model, either be it Akka, Akka.net, or Erlang, that these messages, that these events are being transferred. Was that something that you had been having exposure to, or was that something that you look back at after and discovered event sourcing?
Yeah, it was something I looked back after and discovered event sourcing. Event sourcing doesn't quite cut it because with event sourcing, to get the actual state of the world, you have to replay all the events back to the beginning of time to get what the current state is. I know, yes, they have ways of mitigating it, but it wasn't meant to be a form of data store per se. its job is just to capture events and hold them so that you can replay them later in your system, through your system. The one that is closer to what I'm describing is Datomic, right? So Datomic has the concept of facts. Okay, so you declare facts and those facts are immutable. So the only thing you can do is declare facts on top of facts. You can declare facts that retract or do things like that. So Datomic is more tuned towards, having a data store that, not just an event store, a data store that is immutable. Data is immutable, but at any point in time, you can walk up to it and say, what are the current facts? And it will let you know that.
Part of that is, I asked because you brought up the relation to Git and other source control mechanisms. Is that something that, after you started getting more familiar with this functional programming, changed the way and changed your understanding of source control and things like Git and potentially Mercurial, or did you have a good understanding before that, and then that might have helped piggyback some of your start with some of these functional programming ideas? And as you mentioned, if we can do this for our code, why can't we do this for our database? Where was that relation between realizing that you've got this data store for your file system with Git that's immutable, and immutable objects and immutable data structures, and tying that in with the immutable database? How did those kind of all feed back between each other?
Yeah, I think it was a mixture of playing around with Git and the whole Akka.NET approach to concurrency, which is that in Akka.NET, you don't lock anything. Rather, you have an actor who has serial access to the resource that you are trying to lock. So let's assume I have a record in my database that refers to a single object, and I wanted to change that record, over time. I would send messages to that actor, and the actor would be responsible for changing that record. So it was that idea of having concurrency without locks and looking at the Git file system and how it uses, that approach with immutability that got me thinking. But it was the moment we had this incident where someone went and just wiped the database clean and we couldn't get data back that it now dawned on us that data is sacred, and no matter what, as developers, we should never lose sight of that. For example, somebody could change her last name. Okay, maybe she got married or something, and it has actually caused problems before, because maybe she goes to the bank and they see that, oh, this your last name is not, or you change your account and they see that, oh, this your account is a new account. Are you trying to be fraudulent or things like that? There are scenarios like that. So, but I think it took the period of looking at Git, looking at the file system, looking at how Akka.NET handles concurrency, and then having an incident to realize that this is a serious issue that I think we as a developer community need to work on and fix.
And in the pre-call, you kind of mentioned that one of your wishes for the future would be to be able to see more of these immutable databases. What are you thinking around that? Is that something that you're just hoping people out there realize the value of it, realize that the storage is getting cheap now and it becomes something that people realize is an option? Or what do you see for the future around this as just someone who's looking towards these ideas and seeing coworkers and whether or not they realize the benefit of some of these ideas?
Okay, yeah. Like I said, I looked at a few of them. I looked at Datomic, and it's a pretty good tool, but it's not open source, and it's not really the money, because I could just walk up to a manager in my office and tell them, oh, we need this immutable database, and the company would pay for it. So it wasn't like I was paying for it from my own purse or something like that. But it didn't quite fit the kind of applications we're trying to build, and it's closure heavy, essentially. So the only way you'd be able to consume it over .NET is to use a REST API. So like I said, what I would want is something like maybe MongoDB or something, to have like a Mongo-ish interface that I could just walk up to a collection, ask it for a particular document, and it would return that document. And that document was immutable. So every time there was a change to that document, I would get a brand new document. So that's my actual vision for something like that. And I actually plan on writing that application. In fact, if me and a few of my coworkers, we are looking at doing the preliminary work. Writing a database is not a small task, and we don't even know if we have the experience or capability to do it. But it's one of the things that I want to see if I can just start up something, start up the conversation or come up with a prototype or a demo and see how it goes from there.
And then that leads into you started introducing FSharp into your work environment. You've got stuff out in production. What is the community in your local area look like as far as interest? And you mentioned as well thinking about meetups. And what are you doing to help? I know you're putting blogs and stuff out there for a larger community, but is there any interest in the community where you are? Because I know certain cities, even over here in the States, have certain profiles of the businesses that they run and what languages they like to look at and how willing and accepting they are. What's the community look like where you are for building a community of people in a larger set than just the handful of people at your company that have now adopted FSharp to help spread the word where you are?
Yeah. Again, the community that we have here in Lagos is also, organic. It's mainly most of my friends. We have a group on Facebook, Coders Lounge, where we just hang out, just talk about technology and stuff. And I introduced it there. So a lot of them have been like interested, talking to me about it. Oh, this FSharp, we've seen it, and so on and so forth. So along that line, I started thinking of, okay, maybe we should have a meetup sometime where we can sit down, go through some code katas, work on FSharp problems and so on and so forth. But like I told you, Lagos is a different beast entirely, and most of these people have 2-hour commutes on a daily basis, and their Saturdays and Sundays are also packed. So organizing a meetup has been challenging, but I'm looking at maybe in 2017 next year to come up with a webinar or something like that where we can all sit down or hang out or connect and just talk about FSharp, talk about the challenges people are facing in FSharp, talk about adopting FSharp in their workplaces and things like that.
Some of that is just the general community building because you've got companies that are either very Java centric or very .NET centric, or some of them are Ruby communities or still PHP communities or whatever the language is, and just being able to break that through and build that community in your area. So it may be worth getting you back on to share some of those lessons of just when you have people who are crunched for time, how you fit that in, how you make it available. But wanted to at least see how that was looking from your perspective, because there's some of those lessons from wherever you are. So we're coming up on time, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you at least want to raise attention to, or that you think we should let the audience know about in general?
Well, right now, what interests me a lot about FSharp is actually .NET Core. And I would like us to talk about it a bit because I feel like it has the potential to really take off. Because apparently, I don't know if you've been noticing, but there's a new Microsoft now. It's not the same Microsoft of 5-10 years ago. And that new Microsoft is the one pushing .NET Core. And from the performance things we've seen about it, from the little things I've seen about it, I'm really excited about it. Yeah, the people in the FSharp community aren't that, eager to jump on it, and for good reason, because Microsoft is C# centric at the moment, and they make a lot of changes to the platform. So probably when the platform has stabilized, FSharp development is going to take off on .NET Core. But the interesting part with .NET Core is that it levels the playing field essentially, which is going to make my job easier as someone who is trying to introduce people to FSharp and stuff like that. Is that it levels the playing field because now the tooling and stuff have been removed from Visual Studio and are now command line based like Node and so on and so forth. So from a tooling perspective, in terms of the commands you are using and the compiler and stuff like that, FSharp and C# are on the same level. So it's now a question of language. And I'm pretty confident that if it's a discussion on language, FSharp will always come out on top. But that idea of, okay, now, because part of the problem with FSharp currently is that Microsoft does a lot of improvements to C#. And even though, yes, the FSharp community, and that's another thing I think I need to point out, is that the FSharp community is very separate from Microsoft. In fact, Microsoft has little effect. They still are the major contributors, but most of the things that happen in the FSharp community are the community themselves. Well, I think like moving into .NET Core is going to really increase FSharp adoption because most people are going to now see that, okay, every improvement that is added to .NET affects all languages in .NET, not just C#. So that's one thing I think I'm excited about. And in fact, shout out to Enrico Sada and the people who are working on .NET Core. I really have great respect for them. And, I'm happy to see what comes out of it.
So is that one of those things that it's mainly going to be the features that are coming into core and being put on core that you think is going to help drive the adoption of FSharp, or is it some of the multi-platform support that they're advocating with .NET Core, where the goal is at least that it can run on a Linux system, an OS 10 system, a Windows system? It starts to become platform independent, and you start to have a better portable virtual machine like the Java ecosystem has. So where does that fit in with adoption of FSharp, or is it mainly just the tooling and the libraries around .NET Core then?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. .NET Core is obviously where Microsoft is putting a lot of their efforts into. So ASP.NET Core is built primarily for .NET Core. But what I think is impressive, or what I think is going to really play out in the long run, is that there is a lot of .NET Core is very open. So it wasn't like an afterthought. It wasn't like they did it on Windows and they just ported it to Mac and Linux. They built it from scratch. It's a complete rewrite of .NET from scratch, built cross-platform, and the tooling supports are now built to be language agnostic. So there's nothing, the ASP.NET tooling, the command line stuff, there is nothing about it that is .NET, that is C# centric. Everything there also works for FSharp equally. And if other languages were to come on board, it would work perfectly for them as well. So I think that's where we are going to see a lot of improvements, a lot of innovation happening in that space in the next few days. In fact, I don't know if you heard about it, but Samsung is now part of the .NET Foundation, and most of their Tizen OS is now going to run .NET Core, which now extends the reach of FSharp. So you could use FSharp to write mobile applications like Scott Nimrod does, or you could use it to write TV applications, whatever. So the reach of .NET Core is going to, in the next coming years, is going to be significant, in my opinion.
And so you're thinking it's the wider adoption of the .NET Core that's going to help open up the adoption, and maybe you're going to pull in new people and they're not going to default to C#, they might default to FSharp then, because you start getting Linux people or OS 10 people as well starts to be able to take advantage of this and say, well, if I've got these X number of languages to choose from, I'm not going to be one of the pragmatists who already knows C#. If I'm going to be learning something new, I might as well pick up FSharp kind of thing.
Exactly.
So since we're at time, and I don't want to take too much of your time because you're getting into the evenings because we're offset at this point, but I don't want to take up much more of your evening. Is there anything that you want to make mention to? Is there anything you want to plug? You're talking about some of this stuff. Where are some resources that people can find you and find references and resources for anybody who's out there with FSharp, either from you or from anybody in general that they think are valuable? And then where can people find you online?
Okay, so my blog, I have a blog because, like I told you, my goal is to get as many pragmatists to try out FSharp as possible. So I have a blog where I write about some of the ways of getting into FSharp if you're a pragmatist. If you're just someone who's not interested in academic exercises, you just want to get your hand wet with functional programming and stuff. So my blog is medium.com/realworldfsharp. The real world FSharp it has hyphens in between them. So that's essentially where I put all my blog posts on the ideas of, okay, this is how you create an application in FSharp. This is how you run migrations, do database stuff. Just mundane things are the things I put on there. There is my Twitter handle at OGTrice. I tweet mostly on things of FSharp, although once in a while I can tweet other things too, because I do Android development and web development as well. I think that's all. My Twitter is fine.
And I'll get those and some of those other links that you mentioned in the show notes for the other resources that people can find to get a good overview of some of that FSharp stuff and see what triggered your interest, and maybe that it might trigger them if they're listening and are looking to figure out how to either adopt it themselves or sell it into their organization by having those resources for others. I'd like to give a giant thank you to David Belcher for the logo. And once again, thank you, Odie, for taking your time to join me today. It was a pleasure talking with you, and I am definitely sure we'll have to get you on in the future to give a recap of how you find FSharp and building the community from just your handful of friends that are interested into making this something and helping to bring it along to others, whether or not it's your friends introducing it to their companies or any other future companies in the road, to see how that progress of helping spread the word of FSharp is going locally, and how you found FSharp being picked up globally even as a part of a larger community. So thanks for taking your time to join me. It was a pleasure talking to you, and very interesting getting to dig into some of your stories and figure out some of those lessons we can learn from introducing some of these languages in at work. Until next time, this has been Functional Geekery.
I got to write pretty much the identical code for a transfer. There's payment. There's a Stripe payment or a Stripe payout, but there's also a Stripe transfer, and I need to do something very similar. So transfer is in bank card transactions. Right here. I'm not going to write all the code. I'm just going to basically put in the syntax there. Okay. That right there. Save it. And that would be my go-to. Probably get rid of all the other solutions. My reference point is just career payroll now. Yeah, that's right here. All right, I'm taking off. I'm out. See ya.